When you think about the Cold War, you probably picture a standoff between two giants, right? The United States and the Soviet Union. This massive global chess match with spies, proxy wars, and the terrifying threat of nuclear war. But here's the thing. What if I told you that wasn't the only war being fought?
See, as historian Jonathan Nashel points out, the Cold War wasn't just one struggle. It was actually two. Alongside the whole geopolitical conflict, another battle was raging. A battle among historians over the story itself. Who was to blame? What was it really all about? And how should we remember it?
And that's the big question, isn't it? The truth is, there isn't just one simple answer. Historians have used a bunch of different lenses to try and make sense of the era. So today, let's look through three of the most influential ones to see how our understanding of the Cold War has changed over time.
All right, let's start with the first and most traditional viewpoint. It's known as the orthodox perspective. And what's super important to remember here is that this story was being written while the Cold War was actually happening. So these historians, they didn't have the benefit of hindsight we have today.
From this point of view, the cause of the Cold War was, well, simple: Soviet aggression. Joseph Stalin's communist USSR was seen as this insatiable, expansionist force, and the United States, well, it had no choice but to step in and defend the free world. It was a pretty clear-cut case of good versus evil.
And this whole worldview led directly to the single most important U.S. policy of the entire era: containment. The idea wasn't to, roll back communism where it already was, but more like building a wall around it, to contain it and stop it from spreading any further.
So where'd this idea even come from? Its main architect was a U.S. diplomat over in Moscow named George F. Kennan. In 1946, he sends this massive 5,500-word message back to Washington, famously known as the Long Telegram. His argument was basically that the Soviet Union was expansionist because it was paranoid, and his solution became the bedrock of U.S. policy: long-term, patient, but firm containment.
Okay, so you have this theory of containment. How did that actually translate into action? Well, it pushed the United States into a whole series of conflicts around the globe, creating this really dangerous us versus them dynamic that would define the next 4 decades.
This slide really shows containment in practice. In Korea, the goal was pretty direct: stop a communist invasion. In Vietnam, it was a little more abstract: prevent a domino effect, this fear that if one country fell to communism, all its neighbors would follow. And these proxy wars, fought to contain Soviet influence, cost tens of thousands of American lives, not to mention millions of local lives.
Fast forward to the 1980s, and this orthodox view, it's a major shot in the arm. President Ronald Reagan cast the whole conflict in these really stark moral terms, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. And this wasn't just rhetoric, it was a call to action that led to one of the most massive military buildups in history.
To get a sense of the scale here, let's just follow the money for a second. In 1981, the U.S. defense budget was already a staggering $171 billion.
But just 4 years later, that budget had exploded to over $300 billion. Reagan's administration poured cash into new weapons, a bigger Navy, the Star Wars missile defense program. The arms race was totally in overdrive.
But here's where the story gets even more complicated. This black and white good versus evil worldview, it didn't just play out on the global stage. The fear of a foreign enemy fueled a hunt for supposed subversives inside America's own borders. So most of us have heard of the Red Scare, right? The anti-communist witch hunts. Well, running right alongside it was something called the Lavender Scare. This was a moral panic where gay and lesbian federal employees were systematically targeted, investigated, and fired, all because they were seen as a threat to national security.
And the logic was, well, it was disturbingly simple. And this quote from Senator Kenneth Weary really captures it. The thinking went that because homosexuality was taboo, gay people were vulnerable to being blackmailed by Soviet agents. Therefore, they were security risks. The two groups, communists and homosexuals, were just sort of lumped together as morally weak subversives.
The human cost was just immense. Under an executive order from President Eisenhower, which flat out barred homosexuals from federal jobs, more than 5,000 people were fired. From the State Department, the military, you name it, their careers were destroyed and their lives were completely upended.
So this is the crucial point, right? How can a nation claim to be the virtuous defender of freedom when it's actively persecuting its own citizens? This domestic purge throws a massive, troubling wrench into that simple orthodox narrative. And it wasn't just events at Homer that were challenging the story. By the 1960s, a new generation of historians, plus some big shifts in global politics, began to poke some serious holes in the idea that the Cold War was all the Soviet Union's fault.
This is where the revisionist school comes in, and man, they really flipped the script. They challenged this whole idea of American innocence. They argued that the U.S. wasn't just a passive defender, but an active participant, driven by its own desire for economic expansion. From this view, things like dropping the atomic bomb weren't just about winning the war. They were also a power play to intimidate the Soviets.
And real-world events also made that simple us versus them story a lot harder to believe. The late 60s and 70s saw a period of détente, which is just a fancy word for a thawing of tensions. The superpowers were actually signing major treaties to control nuclear arms and increase cooperation. It proved that, hey, maybe peaceful coexistence wasn't just a fantasy.
Okay, so despite all the thaws and the freezes, the conflict eventually did come to a stunningly rapid end. So how did this half-century war of ideas finally wrap up?
The final act was incredibly swift. When Mikhail Gorbachev took power in 1985, his big reforms unleashed forces he just couldn't control. In 1989, the whole world watched as the Berlin Wall came down. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself was just gone. The Cold War was over.
Now, for the people holding that orthodox view, this was the ultimate validation. Freedom had triumphed over the evil empire. But a third school of thought popped up, the post-revisionists, and they argued for a middle ground. They said, yeah, Soviet paranoia and aggression were real, but so was American ambition and fear. They saw the Cold War less as a simple good versus evil story, and more as a tragic series of miscalculations where both sides shared the blame.
And that leaves us with a final thought. The physical battles of the Cold War might be over, but that intellectual battle for its memory, that's still going on. The way we choose to tell this story as a simple victory, a tale of American imperialism, or a complex tragedy profoundly influences our foreign policy and even who we think we are today. So it's worth asking, when we look back, what lens are we using?